Hey guys, this is Nase here, bringing you the first episode in my new roster recap series. We're going to be going over some of the roster changes made in the upper echelons of the Australian scene that you may or may not have missed. So starting us off, we have Chiefs removing Sterling, and bringing in Dizzy Life. Now Sterling joined this team as an AWPer back at the start of the year. He was fairly inexperienced. His most recent team before that was Darksided, along with players like Goa, Jira, and Hazza, two of which are going to actually come up later in this episode. But yeah, so Sterling was a player that was quite inexperienced. He was definitely a capable AWPer, but it feels like from the sentiments of talking to APOC and Tux, he just wasn't at that level yet that they needed to be making those right decisions and sort of fragging out like they'd hope. Because obviously Chiefs have made quite a few roster changes recently. It's just Tux standing from the legendary IEM Sydney 2017 roster that upset North on Nuke and Renegades on Train. So yeah, they've brought in Dizzy, who is definitely a really strong AWPer. He spent the last couple of years basically in purgatory. He was either not playing or he was playing in these weird legacy lineups that were just mixed teams. Him and Matt CD along with like a bunch of other random players. They managed to win AEM Season 3, also with Legacy. They had Sonic, Mizu, and Nikez in the lineup as well, so it was probably the strongest lineup at that event by far. So yeah, Dizzy coming back, he's definitely a really capable AWPer. We saw back in 2015, he was playing with Chiefs, with that first Chiefs lineup that was signed in CSGO with players like Nova, Zusi, and Ofnu and Lightstep. And then when the time came, when Vox Eminor cut Top Gun due to commitment issues and they brought in Yam, they had Dizzy sitting as a sub. So obviously he has a lot of skill. You can see just in his like rank S pugging and FPL and stuff like that, he is a really strong player. And I think this sort of rounds out the Chiefs fragging core a little bit more with Sterling. Sorry. With Sterling, there was a lot more pressure put on Flix and APOC to sort of frag out, and now I think that pressure is going to be taken off a little bit, as Dizzy is definitely a really explosive AWPer, really confident AWPer as well, and I think that's a piece that Chiefs are missing. They needed that player who was willing to go and take a pick somewhere and have the initiative to do so. So I'm really excited to see what Dizzy Life can do with Chiefs. They've got their first LAN coming up next month at ESL AUNZ. So that's an 8-team LAN that's going to be really exciting for all teams involved, I think. So moving on, not the biggest news, definitely not the biggest news to be following up that Chiefs roster change with, but we've got Niggyman21, aka Nighthawk, leaving Taboo CS. So that lineup currently stands as Strax, Jinx, Skull, and Ares. Nighthawk was sort of this rifling player. Definitely not the most exciting player on that lineup. That would be Jinx and Skull. Those two are really explosive riflers. Nighthawk was sort of more the role player, I guess. And they recently brought in Ares as an in-game leader as Sybe, who was the previous in-game leader, didn't want to do that anymore. And so they decided to cut him because there's no... for me, Sybe is a player that you need as an in-game leader in a roster. That has, that's sitting at this sort of level. These guys are cracking sort of top 8. They qualified for the CGPL, the recent CGPL finals, due to the fact that Greyhound couldn't attend. And the reason I put this news right after the Chiefs one is I think this is a great place for Sterling to land on his feet. This is probably the highest, the highest skilled or highest ranked roster at the moment that is without a player or looking to, add a player. Strax is currently the AWPer of Taboo and has been since this lineup was put together as masterminds, back earlier in the year, late 2017. But I think if Strax is willing to give up that role, I think Sterling would definitely be a great fit for this team. He has a lot of experience. He's been to a couple of LANs in Australia, but then also attended IEM Sydney and actually played really well in that eliminating series against MVP. He was probably the best player on the team there. And we've got testimonials from APOC and Tux both praising him for his in-game knowledge. They just think he doesn't have sort of the right grasp on how to implement that into his game at the moment. So I think Sterling would be a really good fit. Him and Aries are sort of that experienced head. And then you have Skull, Strax, and Jinx fragging out of control below them. So I think that's definitely a really good move that Taboo should at least be looking at. So yeah, moving on. We've got Avant. So Avant recently, a lot of controversy, a lot of strange things going on. They recently, well, I mean, a couple months ago, cut their basically they cut 4 players from their roster, which were Sonic, Mizu, Infrequent, and Kyoto. This was the team that was signed to Avant, and the team that was supposedly going to be representing them in Gfinity, but due to the way Gfinity works, teams hold the spots and not the players. So Avant, for some reason, I guess it was because the team was absolutely terrible, to say the least. For a team that was put together with such like experienced players, you've got so many players that have achieved, won multiple lands in Australia, so many players that have went to international events. The team just didn't play well at all. So yeah, I guess Avant management thought they needed a change, and this is the team they have picked up. They've got Moe, Dans, Herbs, Hazza from the previous lineup, and Zeph. So for me, this is quite an interesting lineup. You've got Dans and Herbs, 2 players that are really experienced in the Oceanic scene. They've been playing together, so there's a lot of synergy there. They've been playing together since 2014, 2015, back on that Dire Wolves lineup, and then Corvidae as well. Alpha Sydney, Corvidae, and then leading into now with Avant. Yeah, so it's good to see those 2 are still sticking around, still finding places on rosters. I think Herbs especially is a really underrated player in the Oceanic scene. He's just got really great raw aim and a lot of great decision making in clutch rounds. And then you've got Moe, this experienced head, a really strong AWPer, and it's great to see this lineup doesn't have another main AWPer, because it seems like Moe has been sort of robbed of that role in previous rosters. He hasn't really had the chance to main AWP for quite some time. So we'll get to see him do that. He'll likely be the in-game leader of this roster as well, and he's proven that he can do so in previous rosters. And he's also, he's just an absolutely experienced player in every sense of the word. He has played international lands in 1.6 and CSGO. So yeah, he's definitely the kind of player that this sort of team needs, especially with players like Hazza and Zeph in the roster. Hazza, as I said earlier, was playing with Darksided, with Sterling and stuff like that. They were a pretty decent team. Then he joined this Avant roster after they decided to cut Disco, so they brought in Hazza. And he's shown to be, quite a capable fragger for such a young player. So his development here will be exciting to watch. You've also got Zeph, who I think is one of the biggest up-and-comers in the Australian scene at the moment. He's a player that basically carried Lucky 7 to the ESL ANZ finals that are coming up. It's sad that Lucky 7 roster is dead, considering Chris O'Wow and Lightstep from that team have gone over to Corvidae. Zeph's come here to Avant. So they're just probably going to be attending that event, just as a mix, going in to have some fun, get some LAN experience. But yeah, Zeph was easily the best fragger on that Lucky 7 roster. So yeah, it's going to be good to see what he can do, being led by a player like Moe, and then having sort of a bit more of a capable fragging core around him, and then also playing in Gfinity, where there's going to be a couple of decent teams there. So moving on, speaking of Gfinity, we've got Ground Zero here. They recently brought in Inject into their ESEA roster. This hasn't been formally announced yet, but you can see there Inject has paid to play the ESEA MDL League. I think it's called MDL in Australia now. So yeah, he's going to be playing that. And the interesting miss there, or the player that's not there, the player that hasn't paid is Apoc Dud, who was the sort of He was a player on this roster beforehand. Um, so this is an interesting change for me. They brought in Inject, definitely an experienced AWPer in the Australian scene. He's been to a couple LANs, played with Avant, not that Avant roster, but played under the Avant organization a while ago. Been to AEM LANs and stuff like that with Lucky Seven, and definitely a strong AWPer. Which is weird because I thought Willie KS on the AWP role was doing quite well for this roster. So bringing in Inject, obviously, that means because Inject is definitely a main AWPer. He's not the kind of player that can also rifle. Sometimes I don't think. I think you'd rather have him on the AWP. So that means Willie KS is going to be dropping back to the a rifling role, possibly. You know, they'd have a killer double AWP setup, which is really good. But yeah, if you've got Inject, Waffy, and Chaotic as your fragging core, I think this team definitely has a lot of potential. Chaotic and Waffy, two really explosive players, two really, quite young players as well. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what this team can do. Instinct and Willie KS as sort of your more supportive core. Willie KS doing the calling as well. So yeah, that's just a small little change for Ground Zero, but I think it could push them past the point where they're at now. Moving on, still on Gfinity because it's never ending. We've got Gfinity's new roster in the Gfinity League, aka the Sydney Raw. They have signed this Havoc and Top Gun mix that was being floated about for a little bit. They said they were looking for an organization, and they found one. So the lineup is Havoc, Destiny, Wizard, Chutch, and Top Gun. Havoc and Top Gun were part of that Atletico lineup that was signed to the organization for about a month and a half and didn't play a single official. So yeah, we haven't seen them play proper CS for quite some time. They both played in that show match at IEM Sydney and both sort of fragged out of control a little bit. Havoc to a lesser extent, but Top Gun was really playing quite well. So yeah, but then I guess you've got Destiny, Wizard, and Chutch in there. So it's quite interesting to me. Chutch basically put up a twit longer like a month ago after he decided to leave Tainted Minds. Or I don't know if he left or got kicked, but he basically said that he doesn't want to play any forms of competitive CS for the foreseeable future. So I guess he couldn't see past 1 month because now he's back with Sydney Raw. This is a bit of a strange roster for me. Definitely a lot of skill, but I doubt that they're going to sort of compete with these top 4 rosters in order: Tainted, Greyhound, and Chiefs. And then I'm not quite sure how these Gfinity teams work because Sydney Raw obviously is literally just an organization set up by Gfinity because no one else wanted the spot. And so you've got these players signed to this organization. Will they be allowed to compete in events outside Gfinity? How's that going to work? Is there some sort of like conflict of interest there? I'm not too sure. But yeah, we're going to see this roster at Gfinity, obviously. Not much to say about him too much, unfortunately. I think Destiny is a really strong player, as always. He's just got that plug-and-play sort of nature where you put him in a roster and he's going to frag out of control as long as you give him the freedom to sort of do what he wants. Wizard, as well, is a similar sort of player. He's quite aggressive on the CT side. T side, not so much, but CT, you really do see him making a lot of calculated or uncalculated pushes. And then Chutch is sort of the dirty work kind of player. He's the kind of player that will entry for you. He'll basically do whatever the team needs. So, yeah. And then Havoc and Top Gun, as I said, played in that show match, but haven't really done anything else since. So you can't really gauge how well they're going to do here. Interesting, they've got Infrequent as a substitute. Obviously, a really strong AWPer. Was part of that Avant roster and one of the players that got cut from that. And then they've got Insanity and Decibel as their draftees, which was from that Gfinity Elite Draft, where a whole bunch of players just like played pugs and then got to the point where they could be drafted by one of these organizations and had to be drafted by one of these organizations. Luckily, the organizations don't have to use the players, they just sort of have to draft them. So yeah, I doubt you'll see Insanity and Decibel get much playtime in this league. So moving on, This is our last full roster announcement. We have Corvidae, who are joined or who have recently signed a new roster, which features the likes of Lightstep, Goa, PZ Kid, Chris Owao, and Misfit. So this is a bit of a band of misfits roster for me. I think you've got Lightstep and Chris Owao who've been playing together since almost like the dawn of time. I think you could say. No, they've been playing together since Avant back in mid 2015, which later turned into that Chiefs roster that had Tux and Zuzi in it, and PDG as well. It sort of became that second best team in Australia, challenging immunity for the best team in Australia position. Yeah, so those two have been playing together for quite some time. They're really experienced, and Lightstep just has a knack for finding sort of young talent players, and then they go on to play in better rosters later on. So, you know, he is sort of that developmental figure for up and coming players in the scene. You've got Goa, who I mentioned earlier, was part of that Dark Side of roster with Hazza and Sterling. So sort of all these players, and Gyra as well. All these sort of players finding, you know, better rosters after that team sort of fell apart. You've got Misfit there, who is a player that hasn't exactly played all that much at the top of the scene. He's definitely been given his chances. He was part of that Plus V lineup during CGPL season, I want to say 11, the one that was completely online and won by Trident, which then turned into Corvidae, so the Dans and Herbs roster. Yeah, he played with Plus V, which had Sniper and Ferg at the helm there. It was sort of just a mixed roster of a whole bunch of like random players that have played at sort of the top of the scene before, so like Moe, and I think Teddy T was there for a little bit as well, and Destiny, those sort of players. Yeah, so you've got Misfit there. He also attended AEM Season 3, I want to say, with, what was that, Funk D, which was a mixed roster, but it had Dick Stacey in it, as well as Senor, who else was there, Soju, and Elusive. So he's definitely, you know, had his shot at playing at sort of these upper echelons, but he's never found a consistent team to sit on. Even in that Plus V lineup, he like rarely played any games. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what he can do in an actual stable roster, where he's sort of given the chance to develop a bit more as a player. He is an AWPer, a main AWPer, so yeah, that's the role he's going to play in this lineup. I think hashtag make Lightstep AWP again. We saw last night, at the time of this recording last night, Lightstep picking up that AWP against what team was it? Sea Dogs in ESEA, and just fragging out of control. But yeah, Misfit's going to be picking that up for this lineup. And then finally you got PZ Kid, who is coming over from Malaysia. He was playing with JYP, which actually had Kaze on it, Kaze or Kaze, the AWPer that went on to play with Flash Gaming. Yeah, PZ Kid was an in-game leader for that roster. Coming in here, he's likely not going to be the in-game leader, considering you've got Lightstep in there. But he actually started fragging out quite well. He definitely wasn't the strongest player in JYP towards like the beginning of that roster, and like leading into now when he's lost a whole bunch of players. But yeah, the most recent lineup, which had a whole bunch of different players, it was a completely different roster. Even had an Australian in there called Snapped, who, I don't know, he's just a player that was from Australia and went over to Malaysia and started playing CSGO. But he started fragging out quite well there, and sort of did so last night as well in that game. That was the first game they played. It was an online match. It was against Sea Dog. There's not much you can take away from it. But yeah, I think PZ Kid sort of has this newfound fragging capability, I guess. And with him not in-game leading this squad, I'm really excited to see what he can do. So that's Corvidae. Bit of a strange roster for me. Sort of strikes me as almost legacy-esque in the fact that there's no real established star player there. You've got two veteran in-game leaders. You've got their right-hand men. You've got, you know, this is actually, this comparison, I didn't think of it until now, but you've got Lons and Lightstep, the in-game leaders. You've got Chris Owao and Yellow, the right-hand men. And then you've got sort of like Goa, Misfit, and PZ Kid, three players who aren't really star players and haven't been star players on previous rosters, but, you know, who knows what they can do. Legacy, obviously, I think a team that's better than the sum of their parts. So let's hope Corvidae can do the same. And just finally, we're going to be moving on to Order. They haven't made a roster change, but this is something that sort of flew under the radar for me a little bit. And it's definitely a weird kind of move. So Order, obviously a team that is also in the Gfinity League, have signed 4 substitutes in Sonic, Mizu, Raz, and Nikes. So obviously Order are expecting to attend some LANs or some international events, and won't be able to attend many Gfinity or play in many Gfinity games, I'm guessing. This is the same with Let's Play Live, the Alpha Invitational thing that Order were also a part of. They were using a completely different lineup that was jokingly called Disorder, that had like Haz and Luke and players like that, just random players. What's his name? Prodigy was playing in that for a little bit. So just random players that they were using while Order were overseas at like Katowice and stuff like that. So yeah, they're obviously, I think, expecting the same sort of outcomes. They're expecting to be attending a lot more international events. So they've basically just signed a second roster to their substitute role. Sonic, Mizu both played together in Avant recently before they got cut. Nikes also played with those players in Legacy, as I mentioned earlier. They won AEM Season 3. And then Raz was part of that Avant roster before he just like inexplicably got cut and no one mentioned it at all. That really tilted me, the fact that Raz was sort of cut from that roster. Raz and Disco were both cut from that roster. Infrequent and Hazard came in, but there was no announcement, nothing like that, no saying like, oh, Raz has been cut from this roster. No, they just decided to not mention it at all and tilt me even further. I feel like, because I kept pointing it out to them on Twitter, I feel like they just like kept avoiding it just to keep me tilted. So yeah, Order have just a second roster for Gfinity, as well as Towski and Spooker as their subs. I don't know anything about Spooker, but I know Towski was part of that MC Esports lineup that recently came top 4 at AEM Season 4. So yeah, all of those MC Esports players are actually in the Gfinity Elite Draft, so that's quite good for them. Definitely players that have a lot of room for growth, especially Doom. I think Doom has a lot of potential. He's part of the Chiefs core of, well, not core, but the Chiefs roster of players for Gfinity. So yeah, after that little tangent, I think that'll do it. That's all the lineup changes and roster moves that I have to talk about for the Australian scene at the moment. Thanks very much for tuning in. I hope to do more of these soon. Probably the next video will be in like a month or so, when every other roster has decided to change out a player for no reason whatsoever. So thanks very much, guys, for tuning in, and I'll see you later.